The Cosmic Terror Commission had existed for 12,000 cycles. In all that time, its purpose had never changed. The commission studied fear. It watched how thinking beings reacted to horror, to dread, to the unknown terrors that lurked between the stars. Every species in the galaxy had been catalogued. Every sapient race had been measured and classified according to how long they could endure before their minds broke. Commissioner Axe had served on the commission for 300 cycles. In that time, he had watched 17 species discover the darker corners of the universe. He had documented their descents into madness with careful precision. Though those graceful beings of light and song had lasted 72 hours when exposed to the whispering void. After that, they simply stopped. Their lights dimmed. Their songs ended. They became hollow shells that breathed but did not live. The crystalline X had fared even worse. When confronted with the reality of what lived in the spaces between dimensions, they had chosen to shatter themselves rather than continue existing with such knowledge. The commission had recorded their final frequencies, the beautiful and terrible sounds of an entire species choosing oblivion over awareness. Even the builders, those ancient ones whose work still orbited dead stars after millions of years, had not survived their encounter with cosmic horror. They had tried to contain the things they found. They had built prisons of folded space and walls of frozen time. In the end, the things they imprisoned had consumed them anyway. Not their bodies. Those remained, preserved in their crumbling monuments. The horrors had consumed their will to continue. This was the universal constant. Every species broke eventually. Fear was the great equalizer of the cosmos. It did not matter how advanced a civilization became, how powerful their weapons, or how vast their knowledge. When faced with true horror, with the things that should not exist but did, every thinking being reached the same conclusion. They could not bear it. They could not endure. Axe reviewed this history often. It comforted him in a strange way. The universe was terrifying beyond measure, but at least it was consistent. At least it followed rules that could be understood and predicted. That comfort ended on the 47th day of the current cycle. The report from Observation Post 7 Gamma arrived during what should have been a routine data review. Axe almost dismissed it as an error. Then he read it again. Then he read it a third time, his 4 hearts beating faster with each pass. A human research vessel had entered the Shroud Territories 21 standard days ago. The Shroud Territories were among the most dangerous regions in map space. Reality itself was wounded there, torn open by some ancient catastrophe that the Commission had never been able to fully explain. The laws of physics became suggestions. Time flowed in wrong directions. The dreams of dead gods still echoed through the void, pressing against the minds of any living beings foolish enough to enter. No species had survived the shroud longer than 6 days. The record had been set by the collective, a hive mind of billions of linked consciousnesses. They had believed their shared mental structure would protect them. They had believed that distributing the horror among so many minds would dilute it to bearable levels. They had been wrong. On the 6th day, the entire collective had turned inward and begun consuming itself, each node trying desperately to escape the thing that had taken root in their shared awareness. The humans had been in the shroud for 21 days. Axe checked the sensor data. The human vessel was still broadcasting. Its engines were still functioning. Life signs remained stable. According to every reading the observation post could gather, the crew was not only alive but actively performing their duties. This was impossible. The Commission had 12,000 cycles of data proving it was impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Axe contacted the observation post directly, demanding confirmation. The response came from Senior Observer Na, one of the Commission's most experienced field agents. She had spent her career watching species encounter the unthinkable. She had documented 47 extinction events and countless individual psychological collapses. Her voice, when she responded, carried something Axe had never heard from her before. She sounded frightened. Not of the shroud, Na had observed the shroud for decades. She knew its horrors intimately, even if she was careful never to experience them directly. No, she was frightened of the humans. She was frightened of what they represented. The humans were not ignoring the shroud's effects. The observation post's readings showed elevated stress hormones in their biology. Their neural activity displayed patterns consistent with extreme fear. Their communications, when intercepted, revealed that they were fully aware of what pressed against their vessel's hull. They could see the impossible geometries. They could hear the whispers. They could feel the weight of ancient, hungry attention focused upon them. They were terrified, yet they continued. Axe summoned an emergency council of the commission. The senior members gathered in the Chamber of Records, surrounded by the preserved testimonies of 1,000 broken species. The holographic archives flickered with images of the lost and the mad, the extinct and the shattered. Every classification the commission had ever created was represented here. None of them applied to what was happening in the Shroud territories. The debate began immediately. Some council members argued that the data must be flawed. Human technology was primitive by galactic standards. Perhaps their instruments were simply failing to detect the psychological damage that must be occurring. Perhaps the crew was already broken, and they were merely observing the final mechanical motions of minds that had already collapsed. Others suggested that humans possessed some unknown biological adaptation, some quirk of their evolution that made them immune to existential dread. Perhaps their brains were simply too simple to fully comprehend what they were experiencing. Perhaps their limited perception was actually a form of protection. Axe listened to all of these theories. None of them satisfied him. The commission had studied human psychology extensively when the species first made contact with the wider galaxy. Humans were not stupid. They were not incapable of comprehension. If anything, they seemed almost painfully aware of their own mortality and insignificance. They had developed entire philosophical traditions around confronting the meaninglessness of existence. They should have broken faster than most species, not slower. The council debated for 16 hours without reaching any conclusion. Finally, Axe made a decision that would change everything. He ordered senior observer Na to make direct contact with the human vessel. The commission had never before intervened in an ongoing observation. The protocols were clear about maintaining distance, about not contaminating the subjects with outside influence. But the protocols had been written based on assumptions that were crumbling by the hour. The humans were still alive on day 22. They were still functioning on day 23. By day 24, they had begun conducting scientific surveys of the shroud itself, treating the wounds in reality as objects of curiosity rather than sources of madness. Something was deeply wrong with these creatures, or perhaps something was deeply right. Either way, the commission had to understand. Na accepted her orders without protest, though Axe could see the reluctance in her movements. She had spent her entire career observing from a safe distance. Now she was being asked to approach something that frightened her more than anything else in her long experience. Not the shroud. She had made peace with the shroud long ago. The humans frightened her. They were doing what no other species had ever done. They were enduring. They were persisting. They were looking into the face of cosmic horror and refusing to look away. Somehow, impossibly, they were finding ways to continue. Na departed for the human vessel on day 25. Axe watched her ship disappear into the torn space of the Shroud territories, carrying with it the hopes of a commission that had suddenly realized it might know far less about the universe than it had believed. The humans had been classified as a minor species, barely worth study. They had developed primitive space travel only a few centuries ago. They had no great monuments, no ancient wisdom, no cosmic significance. Yet they were alive in a place that killed gods. And the commission needed to know why. Na's shuttle approached the human vessel slowly, following protocols that suddenly seemed inadequate for the situation. The ship ahead of her was called the Perseverance, according to the translated designation painted on its hull. It was a small vessel by galactic standards, designed for a crew of perhaps 40 beings. Its construction was practical rather than elegant, built from materials that showed their age and use. It should have been a tomb by now. Every model the Commission had developed predicted that the crew would be dead or insane within the first week. Yet as Nud drew closer, she could see lights moving behind the viewports. She could detect the heat signatures of living bodies going about their tasks. She could hear, on the open communication channels, the mundane chatter of people who were very much alive. They were discussing meal schedules. Someone was complaining about a malfunctioning water recycler. Two crew members were debating the results of something called a basketball game that had occurred before they entered the shroud. The shroud pressed against Nuz's consciousness even through her shuttle's protective shielding. She could feel the whispers at the edge of her thoughts, the ancient hungers that had waited in this place for longer than stars had burned. She knew what these humans were experiencing. She knew the weight that must be pressing against their minds at every moment. Yet they talked about basketball. The docking procedure was surprisingly smooth. The humans had been expecting contact from the wider galaxy, apparently. They had protocols for receiving visitors. A young human in a worn uniform met Na at the airlock, his face showing the strain of prolonged stress but his posture steady and his movements controlled. His name was Lieutenant, and he welcomed Na to the Perseverance with what he called standard hospitality procedures. This involved offering her refreshments and asking about her journey, as if she had arrived from a neighboring station rather than crossed into a region of space that had driven entire civilizations to extinction. Nud declined the refreshments and requested a tour of the vessel. She needed to understand what was happening here. She needed to see how these humans were managing to survive. What she found over the next several hours would form the foundation of her report to the Commission. It would be studied and debated for centuries to come. It would eventually force a complete restructuring of how the galaxy understood fear, endurance, and the nature of sapient consciousness. But in that moment, walking through the corridors of the Perseverance, Na was simply trying not to let her own terror show. The humans were not pretending the shroud did not exist. That was the first thing she noticed. They did not deny what was happening around them. In the common areas, crew members spoke openly about the nightmares they had experienced, about the shapes they had seen pressing against the viewports in the middle of the night cycle, about the whispers that tried to worm their way into unguarded minds. They were afraid. Na could see it in every face she encountered. The fear lived in their eyes, in the tension of their shoulders, in the slight tremor that occasionally passed through their hands. These were not beings who had somehow become immune to horror. They felt it as keenly as any other species would. Yet they continued. A human woman named Dr. Sarah served as the vessel's chief scientist. Her hands shook slightly as she calibrated navigation equipment in the research bay, but her voice was steady when she explained what they were doing. She spoke of mapping the anomalies in local spacetime, of gathering data on the psychological effects of shroud exposure, of trying to understand the nature of the entities that seemed to exist here. Na asked her how she managed to continue working despite the fear. Doctor paused for a long moment, considering the question as if no one had ever asked it before. Then she told Na about her grandmother. The woman had lived through something called the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign during one of humanity's many internal conflicts. For months, explosions had rained from the sky. Entire cities had burned. Death could come at any moment from any direction, with no warning and no defense. Doctor's grandmother had been a child during that time. She had spent her nights in underground shelters, listening to the sound of destruction above. She had learned to sleep through the rumbling, to eat her meals while the ground shook, to continue living even when every moment might be her last. She had passed that knowledge on to her children. They had passed it on to theirs. Humanity, Doctor explained, had been practicing this skill for a very long time. Now moved on to speak with other crew members. Each of them had similar stories to tell. One man described ancestors who had been taken from their homes in chains, forced into bondage for generations, and emerged on the other side to build nations and shape civilizations. A young engineer mentioned grandparents who had survived famine, who had learned to find food where none seemed to exist, who had refused to die even when death seemed like the only reasonable option. Another crew member, when asked how she coped with the constant presence of cosmic horror, simply shrugged and mentioned something called retail work during the holiday season. Nuh did not understand the reference, but the other humans nearby laughed in recognition. They laughed. In the Shroud territories, surrounded by the dreams of dead gods, they laughed. Nuh observed their daily routines with growing fascination. They had developed rituals to manage their terror. Every evening, the crew gathered in the common area to share a meal. The food was simple, the kind of basic nutrition that sustained life without providing much pleasure, but the gathering itself seemed to serve a purpose beyond sustenance. They told stories during these meals. Sometimes the stories were about their lives before the voyage, about homes and families and ordinary experiences. Sometimes the stories were about the shroud itself. This was the part that most confused Nuh. They told stories about the horrors they had witnessed. They described the impossible shapes they had seen, the voices that had tried to speak through their dreams, the moments when reality had bent and twisted around them. They told these stories with words that somehow transformed the experiences. They made the horrors smaller. They gave them names that sounded absurd. They found details to laugh at, angles to mock, weaknesses to ridicule. The entity that had pressed against the hull on the third day, the one that had radiated pure existential dread, had been nicknamed by the crew. They spoke of visits with annoyed familiarity, as if he were a difficult neighbor rather than a manifestation of cosmic wrongness. They checked on one another constantly. None noticed crew members approaching their colleagues with a simple question, "You doing okay?" The answers varied. Sometimes people said they were fine. Sometimes they said not really. Both answers were accepted without judgment. When one crew member broke down sobbing in a corridor, overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of what she had experienced, the others did not try to fix her. They did not offer solutions or demand that she recover. They simply sat with her. They stayed close until she could stand again. Then they helped her get back to her duties, moving slowly, allowing her to find her own pace. No species in the Commission's records had ever done this. When beings broke under the weight of cosmic horror, they broke alone. Their companions either fled or broke with them. The idea of simply sitting with someone's pain, of sharing the burden without trying to eliminate it, had never been recorded. Nuh spent 3 days aboard the Perseverance. In that time, she filled 17 data tablets with observations and notes. She recorded hundreds of hours of interviews and behavioral studies. She analyzed the crew's biological markers, their neural patterns, their psychological profiles. When she finally departed, her report to the Commission contained a phrase that would be debated for centuries. It was not elegant, it was not comprehensive, but it captured something essential about what she had witnessed. "They do not overcome fear," she wrote, "they coexist with it." The Perseverance remained in the Shroud territories for another 43 days before completing its survey and returning to normal space. All 40 crew members survived. Many of them would require psychological support in the months that followed. A few would carry permanent marks from what they had experienced. But they all came home. And the Commission, for the first time in its long history, had to admit that it did not understand what it had observed. The models were wrong. The classifications were inadequate. Everything they thought they knew about fear and endurance had been called into question. Humans were not supposed to be able to do what they had done, yet they had done it anyway. The question of why would occupy the Commission for years to come. But first, they had to decide what to do with the knowledge they had gained. The galaxy needed to know that something had changed. A new kind of being had entered the cosmic stage, and they carried their terror like a companion rather than allowing it to become their master. The Emergency Council had been in session for 40 hours when Commissioner Axe finally called for a vote. The Chamber of Records had never witnessed such prolonged debate. The holographic archives flickered overhead, displaying the testimonies of 1,000 shattered species, while below, the senior members of the Cosmic Terror Commission argued about the fate of humanity. The factions had emerged quickly. The largest group, led by council member, demanded immediate quarantine of the human species. Their argument was straightforward, and Axe had to admit, logical by conventional standards. The humans represented an unknown variable in a universe that had followed predictable rules for millions of years. If they could truly coexist with cosmic horror in ways no other species could match, they might serve as vectors of psychological contamination. What if their presence normalized terror for other species? What if beings who encountered humans began to believe they too could endure the unendurable, only to discover too late that they lacked whatever strange adaptation allowed humans to persist? The quarantine faction argued that humanity should be isolated, studied from a distance, and never allowed to spread their dangerous example beyond their native star systems. The second faction, smaller but equally passionate, argued for direct intervention of a different kind. Council member led this group. She believed the humans should be studied more closely, their psychological patterns analyzed down to the smallest detail, their biological processes examined at every level. If humans possessed some secret to enduring horror, the galaxy had a right to know it. Perhaps their adaptation could be replicated. Perhaps other species could be modified to share their strange gift. The methods proposed were not gentle. She spoke of captured subjects and controlled experiments, of pushing humans to their absolute limits to understand where those limits actually lay. Some of the techniques she described had been used on other species in the Commission's early history, before ethical guidelines had been established. They had produced results, but the cost had been high. The third faction was the smallest, barely a handful of members clustered at the edge of the chamber. They did not have a clear leader. They barely seemed to have a clear position. But their argument, when Axe finally demanded that they state it, was the most unsettling of all. Perhaps, they suggested, the Commission itself was fundamentally flawed. Perhaps 12,000 cycles of studying fear and cataloging collapse had blinded them to the possibility that endurance was even possible. Perhaps they had been asking the wrong questions all along. The debate continued through the night and into the next day. Evidence was presented. Records were consulted. The entire history of the Commission was examined, and in light of what the humans had demonstrated. Finally, as exhaustion began to claim even the most energetic debaters, Axe made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He invited a human to address the council. Dr. Sarah arrived at the Commission's headquarters aboard a diplomatic vessel. She had been traveling for 3 weeks, crossing sectors of space that humans had barely begun to explore. When she stepped into the Chamber of Records, she became the first human to stand in a space that had witnessed the final testimonies of extinct civilizations. She was small by galactic standards, her biological frame fragile and short-lived compared to the beings who surrounded her. Her hair had begun to show traces of gray, a visible reminder of human mortality. Her hands still trembled slightly, a permanent reminder of what she had experienced in the Shroud territories. Yet when she faced the assembled council, beings who had watched the death of stars and the collapse of empires, she showed no sign of intimidation. Axe asked her to explain what the Commission had witnessed. How had her species endured what had broken every other thinking being in recorded history? Doctor was quiet for a long moment, then she began to speak. "You have spent 12,000 cycles studying how species break," she said. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying easily through the vast chamber. In all that time, did you ever think to study how they heal? The council was silent. No one had considered that question before. Every species in the galaxy experiences trauma, Doctor continued. You have observed this. You have recorded it. But what you seem to have missed is what happens afterward. You watch until the breaking point and then you look away. You assume the story is over. She walked slowly toward the center of the chamber, passing beneath holographic records of shattered civilizations. For humans, the breaking point is never the end. It cannot be. Our ancestors learned this lesson long before we ever reached the stars. The world tried to break us over and over again. Disease, famine, war, disaster, cruelty beyond imagination, inflicted by our own kind upon each other. Every generation faced some new horror that should have been enough to destroy us. She stopped beneath the image of the builders, those ancient ones who had tried to contain cosmic horror and been consumed by it. But we are still here, not because we found ways to avoid the horror, not because we became immune to fear. We survived because we learned to transform our relationship with terror itself. Doctor turned to face the council directly. Fear is not our enemy. Fear is information. It tells us something matters enough to lose. When we feel afraid, we know we are approaching something important, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. The council members shifted uneasily. This was not the explanation they had expected. Your records show that the builders tried to imprison the things they found in the dark spaces between stars, Doctor said. They tried to contain horror behind walls of frozen time and folded space. They believed that if they could keep the terrible things separate from themselves, they would be safe. She shook her head slowly. We do not imprison our horrors. We could not if we tried. They are part of us now. Every trauma we have survived lives inside us still. We carry the memories of every ancestor who endured the unendurable. Their fear flows in our blood. Their nightmares echo in our dreams. But we have learned to carry them as companions rather than masters. We give them names. We tell their stories. We transform them through the telling, making monsters into myths, tragedies into songs. We take the weight of horror and we spread it among ourselves, sharing the burden until no single person must bear too much. Doctor gestured toward the observation port, where the distant stars of the Shroud territories still glowed with their wounded light. Even that place, she said. In 100 years, humans will tell their children stories about it. We will make it ours, not by conquering it, not by containing it, by accepting it as part of our experience and transforming it through our collective memory. The council remained silent. Many of them had never heard a perspective like this. The idea that horror could be transformed rather than eliminated, that fear could be carried rather than overcome, was foreign to everything they had learned. Axe finally spoke. He asked the question that had haunted him since the first reports from the Shroud territories arrived. How long can you endure? Is there a limit to what your species can bear? Doctor smiled, though there was sadness in it. We do not know, she admitted. We have never found the limit. Every time we think we have reached the point where we must finally break, we discover that we can take one more step, and then another, and then another. She paused, considering her words carefully. Perhaps there is a horror somewhere in the universe that would finally destroy us. Perhaps we will one day encounter something so vast and terrible that even our endless capacity for adaptation will not be enough. But we will not know until we reach that point. And we will not stop trying to survive until we do. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. The quarantine faction received significant support. The intervention faction received less, but their arguments had clearly moved some members. In the end, however, a plurality of the council chose a different path. They created a new classification. For 12,000 cycles, the Commission had organized species according to how they broke. The categories were clear: Immediate collapse, gradual deterioration, delayed onset, catastrophic failure. Every thinking being in the galaxy fits somewhere within these classifications. Humanity did not fit, so the Commission invented a new category for them. They were classified as pterodactyl. The term acknowledged what had observed aboard the Perseverance. Humans did not overcome fear. They did not become immune to it. They adapted to it. They transformed their relationship with it. They found ways to carry horror inside themselves without being destroyed by it. The ruling was recorded in the Chamber of Records, inscribed in materials that would outlast stars. It would be studied by countless species in the centuries to come. Some would find hope in it. Others would find only confusion. A few would find fear of a different kind, fear of a species that could do what they could not. The closing line of the ruling would be carved into monuments across 1,000 worlds. It would be translated into every known language. It would become part of the galaxy's shared understanding of what was possible for thinking beings. Where other species see an ending, the ruling declared, humans perceive only a darker chapter in a story they refuse to stop telling. Doctor remained at the Commission headquarters for several more weeks. She gave additional testimony. She answered countless questions. She helped the Council begin to understand what they had witnessed. Before she departed for Earth, she stood one last time in the Chamber of Records. The holographic archives flickered around her, displaying the testimonies of broken species, the final words of civilizations that had surrendered to cosmic horror. Axe found her there, staring up at the lights. He asked her if she felt sad, looking at all these records of failure and extinction. Doctor considered the question for a long moment. "I feel grateful," she finally said. "Every one of these species contributed something to the universe before they fell. Their art, their science, their philosophy, the things they learned and created. None of it is truly lost. It lives on in the knowledge they shared, the connections they made, the impact they had on others." She turned to face him. "That is how we think about our own dead. They are not gone. They are transformed. They become part of the story we continue to tell. And as long as someone remembers them, as long as someone tells their stories, they have not truly ended." Axe did not fully understand. Perhaps he never would. But he recognized that he was witnessing something important, a different way of thinking about existence, a different relationship with mortality and meaning. Doctor departed the next morning. Her ship carried her back toward human space, toward a species that was only beginning to understand its place in the wider galaxy. Behind her, the Commission continued its work, but something had changed. The questions they asked were different now. The assumptions they made had shifted. They had learned that fear was not always an ending. Sometimes it was just the beginning of a longer story. And somewhere in the distant dark, the humans continued to tell their tales. They carried their horrors with them like old friends. They transformed their tragedies into songs. They refused to stop telling the story.